My mom's new husband and his kids went on a trip without telling me, leaving me alone at home. I chose to stay with my dad, and things quickly began to fall apart. I'm a 16-year-old guy currently navigating the challenges of high school. My mom, who is 40 years old, and my stepdad, age 42, have been a part of my life for quite some time, though they never officially married. My actual arrival into the world came from a brief post-college fling between my parents. What they assumed would last a few months led to my unexpected conception. Despite the initial surprise, my mom chose to continue the pregnancy, and my dad expressed a desire to be involved in my life. As a result, they arranged shared custody. I spend equal time with each parent, switching homes monthly, which has required both to make considerable sacrifices. To facilitate our arrangement, they've both remained in the same city, foregoing several career advancement opportunities to ensure minimal disruption in my upbringing. My mom also turned down several suitors who were deeply interested in her, choosing instead to focus on raising me. This prioritization of family over personal and professional opportunities came to light through conversations instigated by my stepdad, Eddie. Though he's far from ideal in the role, my mom explained her choices to help me come to terms with his presence in our lives. She believes that accepting Eddie is a small gesture of gratitude for the sacrifices made on my behalf, though I've never felt that these sacrifices were my responsibility. While Eddie isn't overtly unkind, his demeanor and approach to family dynamics leave much to be desired. Yet, out of love for my mom and a desire to see her happy, I've tried to embrace his presence in our lives. Eddie's demeanor towards me is unmistakable. He simply does not like me, and he makes no effort to conceal it. It's perplexing to consider why a 42-year-old would take issue with a 16-year-old like me, especially since I've never done anything to provoke him. Raised to treat everyone with kindness, I've always extended that courtesy to him, regardless of his apparent disdain. For the past 3 years, he has completely ignored my presence, never speaking rudely nor making derogatory comments simply because he does not speak to me at all. It's as if I'm invisible within our family, a situation that emerged suddenly one day. He shifted from acknowledging me to acting as though I did not exist, leaving me baffled about what I could have possibly done to offend him. This silent treatment is alien to me and feels intensely uncomfortable. It's like receiving the cold shoulder over an unknown transgression, and without knowing the cause, I'm powerless to correct my behavior. My mother explains it away by saying that's just Eddie's nature. He doesn't specifically have a problem with me, but he also doesn't have any particular fondness for me. However, I struggle with the notion that disliking someone doesn't require justification, especially when there's such a significant age gap. I sometimes wonder if his discomfort stems from me being my mother's first child, but really, I'm left with only guesses. What's clear, though, is his deliberate choice to make his feelings, or lack thereof, evident. Initially, our relationship was somewhat cordial. During his first few visits, Eddie seemed interested in my life, asking me various questions to which I responded politely. But after one particular visit, he abruptly stopped communicating. At first, I thought he might have simply forgotten to greet me. But as this pattern persisted, it became impossible to overlook. I questioned my mother about whether I had inadvertently upset him, especially as he would pointedly turn away whenever I entered the room. She suggested that Eddie was still adjusting to the idea of dating someone with a child, having only been involved with women who didn't have children before. I found it difficult to accept my mother's explanation that Eddie was just adjusting to having me around, especially since he already had 2 sons, aged 15 and 12. Their mother had tragically passed away in an accident shortly after the younger one was born. Moreover, it wasn't as though I was always at my mother's house. I stayed with my dad every other month. Despite this, months passed without change, and I eventually resigned myself to the reality that Eddie would no longer speak to me. A year into their relationship, Eddie proposed to my mother. They married a few months later, and Eddie, along with his children, moved into our home. Prior to their marriage, I had only met his sons a few times, and it was apparent that they had been instructed by their father to also ignore me. The whole situation was bewildering, and enduring it over the years was incredibly challenging. Before marrying my mother, Eddie had lived with his ailing mother. After the wedding, he relocated her to his sister's house, enabling him and his children to move in with us. Living with people who actively ignored my presence was distressing. It felt like being treated as a pariah without understanding what I had done to deserve such treatment. As the years went by, I grew accustomed to the silence that met me each time I visited my mother's home. Preparing mentally for these visits became routine, knowing that my mother would be the only one to interact with me. The house felt cold and unwelcoming, with Eddie and his children persisting in their indifference. Despite the pain this situation caused, I continued visiting because of the precious moments I got to spend with my mother. I had urged her multiple times to address this issue with Eddie to uncover the root of his behavior or at least attempt to resolve the tension. However, she insisted that she had spoken to him and cited vague personal reasons he had for ignoring me, reasons she could not disclose. This secretive handling of the situation by my mother only added to the strain, leaving me feeling isolated and misunderstood within my own family. The lack of communication and resolution made each visit a test of resilience. As I grappled with being made to feel invisible in a place that was supposed to be a home, my mother's stance was clear. I needed to tolerate the situation. Whenever I tried to assert myself, she would become emotional, accusing me of ingratitude while reminding me of the sacrifices she had made. She urged me to overlook Eddie's behavior for her sake. Although I wanted to confront her, I couldn't bear the thought of hurting her feelings. Recently, an incident occurred that made the ongoing tension even more palpable. Eddie took his children on a vacation without informing me, leaving me alone in the house unexpectedly. Consequently, I decided to stay with my dad, where unbeknownst to him, the situation quickly escalated. I had kept all of this from my father, fearing his reaction would exacerbate things, potentially leading to a custody battle, a scenario I desperately wanted to avoid. My parents have always had differing parenting styles, leading to frequent minor disagreements. However, I knew that revealing the full extent of the issues with Eddie could provoke a significant conflict between them. To avoid drama, I maintained a facade that everything was fine when I was with my mother and her new family. Eddie and my mother had been a couple for a year before getting married and have lived together for 2 years. Enduring 3 years of their neglect had left me feeling increasingly worn thin. Recently, an incident finally pushed me to my limit. I had been struggling with personal issues, including conflicts with friends at school, which left me emotionally vulnerable. This feeling of isolation intensified when, after planning to spend a month at my mother's, I woke up one morning to find the house eerily quiet and completely empty. The abruptness of their departure was shocking. Just the night before, the routine had been the usual, Eddie and his kids speaking among themselves and excluding me. There had been no hint of a trip. Panicked and confused, I immediately called my mother to find out what was happening. Fortunately, my mother answered my call. When I confronted her about their sudden departure, she casually mentioned they had gone on a week-long trip and wanted me to stay behind to look after the house. I was on summer break with no school obligations, but the expectation for me to act as a makeshift security guard didn't sit well with me. I expressed my dissatisfaction clearly, stating that being left in the dark and expected to watch the house was not appropriate. If she was concerned about security, a proper system should have been in place rather than leaving me uninformed and alone. More than anything, I was upset about not being included in the decision or even informed of the trip, depriving me of the choice to agree or make other plans. Under different circumstances, I might have enjoyed the freedom of an empty house. As a high school student, the prospect of inviting friends over for a few days would normally be appealing. However, the manner in which the situation unfolded, coupled with ongoing disagreements with my friends, left me too frustrated to consider hosting anyone. I insisted that my mother owe me an apology for the oversight. While I could somewhat accept Eddie's aloofness, the least they could have done was inform me of their travel plan. It felt incredibly dismissive to wake up to an empty house with no prior notice. My mother dismissed my concerns as an overreaction and abruptly ended the call before I could respond. I attempted to reach her again, but she did not answer. Instead, she texted saying she was trying to enjoy her trip and would talk upon reaching the hotel. Overwhelmed and feeling neglected, I decided to leave the house unattended. After several failed attempts to inform her, I placed the keys under a potted plant, as was customary, and headed to my dad. Arriving unexpectedly at my dad's, I finally disclosed everything about how Eddie and his children treated me and my mother's indifference to my distress. My dad was taken aback, expecting me to have stayed at my mother's until month's end. Sharing these grievances felt crucial, especially since my mother had continually overlooked the impact of their behavior on me. My mother justified Eddie's behavior by citing his personal reasons, which she considered valid, but she refused to share any details with me. Despite her secrecy, I tried to accommodate her wishes, mindful of the sacrifices she often reminded me she had made for my happiness. However, the strain was becoming unbearable. After sharing everything with my father, he reassured me that he would handle the situation. Although clearly upset, he carefully avoided criticizing my mother directly to me. He expressed relief that I had confided in him and made it clear that I was welcome to live with him permanently. He advised against returning to my mother's, but left the decision up to me. For the next 5 days, I made no attempt to contact my mother, and notably, she did not reach out to me either. It seemed the least she could do was check on her son, whom she had left alone while she vacationed with her new family. Speaking with my father had lightened my spirits, and I resolved not to let the situation weigh me down. When my mother finally called, it was not to inquire about my well-being. Instead, she was irate, accusing me of negligence because their house had been burglarized during her absence. The robbers had taken several valuable items, including the television. Amid her accusations, I explained that I had tried multiple times to inform her of my departure to my father's house, but she had ignored my calls. She retorted that I should have texted her, a fair point, but one I had overlooked in my frustration. This revelation escalated into a heated argument. She insisted that I should have remained at home regardless of my feelings, arguing that my presence was crucial for the house's security, a responsibility I had never agreed to accept. The disagreement underscored a deep rift in our expectations and communication, highlighting the ongoing tension that had driven me to seek refuge with my father. These events were the consequences of her decisions, not mine. Yet, in a stunning turn of events, when my mother and Eddie returned from vacation, they tried to place the blame squarely on me, which was both unfair and absurd. The first time Eddie spoke to me in years wasn't to reconcile or explain, but to accuse me of negligence and predict doom because of my supposed carelessness. His accusations were baffling, especially since we had hardly interacted. This blame game escalated tensions, sparking a conflict between my parents. My father sided with me, believing the responsibility lay with my mother, while she insisted that I was to blame. Now, she's demanding compensation from my father for the damages, claiming that if he supports my actions, he should also bear the financial consequences. Caught in this dispute, she has put forth a condition. She will only let the matter go if I apologize to her and Eddie. I'm torn. I don't want to apologize for something I don't believe was my fault, but I also wish to shield my father from this ongoing hassle. Am I wrong for leaving the house unoccupied to stay with my father after being left alone without notice? It seems unjust that I'm being pressured to mend fences when I was the one left in the dark. 2 weeks have passed since the incident, and new revelations have shed light on Eddie's resentment towards me. It turns out that when Eddie and my mother first began dating, he had suggested his mother move in with them. My mother declined, uncomfortable with the pace of their relationship and the idea of living with his ailing mother. Despite Eddie's assurances that his mother would have a full-time nurse and needed only company for her emotional well-being, my mother was not prepared to take on what she saw as a burden. However, instead of addressing this directly with Eddie, she blamed her refusal on me. This revelation came about 3 months into their increasingly serious relationship, though I felt it was too soon for such commitment. This manipulation by my mother likely planted the seeds of Eddie's disdain towards me, marking the beginning of our strained relation. However, I've chosen not to dwell on my mother's decisions. She had misled Eddie by indicating she was open to him moving in with his mother and children, but she later expressed reservations, citing me as the reason. She portrayed me as a troublemaker, claiming that my attempts to protect her from previous boyfriends were because I harbored hopes of reuniting my parents, a sentiment she didn't want to crush. Moreover, she suggested to Eddie that I would be hostile towards his mother, whom she falsely claimed I had described as a useless burden. She went as far as to say I threatened to make her life miserable if she moved in, which couldn't be further from my true character. Similarly, she told him I had called his children little evil goblins, setting the stage for his complete withdrawal from any interaction with me. Eddie had taken these fabrications to heart, believing them without witnessing any such behavior from me firsthand. This misunderstanding had been festering until recently when Eddie pressed my mother to sever ties with me. Faced with escalating demands, my mother was compelled to disclose the truth, that her reluctance to have his mother move in was hers alone, not mine. Upon learning he had mistreated me based on falsehoods, Eddie was appalled. He realized the severity of the deception and decided they could no longer live together under such circumstances. In his email, he mentioned that had my mother been truthful about her inability to care for a sick person, he would have sought alternatives with his sister, ensuring his mother was cared for without imposing on us. Eddie's email also contained an apology for everything he had put me through, acknowledging his mistakes. I have yet to reply as I'm still processing the revelations and their implications. Right now, my priority is to clear my head and step away from the turmoil. But these are the reasons behind his prolonged mistreatment and my mother's tolerance of it. It turned out that my mother's manipulations were working perfectly to her advantage. She fed Eddie a constant stream of lies about my behavior, claiming I was always in trouble at school. Since Eddie trusted her implicitly and we never spoke, he had no way to see that I was actually quite a normal guy, effectively maintaining my mother's deceitful narrative. My mother's actions have revealed a disturbing side to her. Upon discovering the full extent of her manipulations, my father decided to file for full custody. Meanwhile, my mother professed her devastation, claiming her desire was for us to be a happy family. However, her version of happiness was constructed at the expense of everyone else's well-being. In a surprising turn of events, not only did my dad initiate custody proceedings, but Eddie also started divorce proceedings. My mother reached out to my dad in desperation, pleading with him to speak to Eddie and salvage their marriage, as she couldn't bear the thought of losing us all. Her expectations for reconciliation seemed unrealistic, given her long history of deception. Throughout these years, my mother was content to see me unfairly vilified, standing by as Eddie and his family grew to despise me based on her falsehood. It's a painful realization to understand that she prioritized her well-being over the truth, causing me unnecessary suffering. I've made the difficult decision to cut off all contact with her. After enduring years of mistreatment for her supposed happiness, it's clear she never reciprocated my affection or concern. My patience and forgiveness were met with betrayal and selfishness, and I no longer see a reason to maintain a relationship with her. As the fallout continues, the community buzzes about Eddie's divorce filing. My mother's reaction has been to post melancholic quotes on social media, which my cousins have shown me through screenshot. This public display of sorrow does little to mend the situation she has orchestrated. After a contentious battle, the court granted my father full custody. My mother fought fiercely to maintain her parental rights, but the evidence of her actions was overwhelming. Her legal team managed to prolong the proceedings, but ultimately, the outcome was inevitable. Now, with my father as my custodial parent, I am under no obligation to visit my mother, though she retains visitation rights. I doubt I will use them as I have no desire to reconnect. Life with my father is stable and fulfilling, and I've even reconciled with my friends. I'm now focused on moving forward, leaving the past and its turmoil behind.